Hello, I'm Jeff Morgan. You are listening to The Shadow of Tartarus, the first book in the Tartarus series. This is an authorized audio recording. If you're interested in the following story, please like and subscribe to my channel. A full list of my books are available on Amazon Kindle. Thank you and enjoy.
Chapter 4: The Cathedral of Lost Souls. Arthur's flashlight cut a narrow path through the desert night as he walked westward toward the ridge, its feeble beam engulfed by the endless darkness. Each footstep resonated gently into the void. The crunch of his boots against the brittle sand was the sole sound anchoring him to reality. Above, the stars hung like fragments of shattered glass, unnervingly sharp and cold. They seemed alive, watching him with a detached indifference that sent a ripple of anxiety through his body. He paused, tilting his head back to take in the immense domain of constellations. They were familiar, yet wrong. Orion's belt twinkled with its usual brilliance, but the arrangement was subtly off. It was as if someone had nudged the stars a fraction of an inch across the sky. The dissonance tightened his throat, a small but profound violation of natural order. Same stars, he murmured to himself, his breath visible in the desert chill. But not the same placement and seemingly closer. What was more, the entire night sky displayed lustrous bands of nebula in eclectic alien hues. The spectacle grew in vividness with every step he took toward the strange gleam in the distance. A bewildering tangle of awe and confusion crept through his bones, drawing a shiver up his spine. But his march pressed on. He gripped his flashlight tighter. As he walked, he focused on the worn grooves of its handle, something tangible to ground him against the growing sense of otherness. Was this still the Nevada desert, or was it not? The more he tried to rationalize the bizarre sensations around him, the less certain he became. Arthur shook his head, forcing his eyes back to the ridge ahead of him. It hovered against the horizon, a jagged silhouette bathed in an eerie sheen. A flicker of movement, just at the edge of his peripheral vision, stopped him mid-step. His hand instinctively went to his holster, but when he swung the flashlight toward the spot, there was nothing. Just the wind, he assured himself. His heartbeat betrayed his unease. He was no stranger to the desert's tricks, shadows that danced and whispered when the mind was either too tired or too alert. But this didn't feel like a trick. Pushing the thought aside, he continued on. The glow beyond the ridge intensified with each step closer, drawing him forward like a moth to a flame. At long last, he reached the summit of the ridge. His breath came shallow and quick, and his feet ached from the lengthy march. With the back of his hand, he wiped the sweat that had clung to his brow despite the chill. He peered down the hill to see what it was that had pulled him here. What he saw stole the air from his lungs entirely. As though it had been conjured from a fever dream, the structure below him seemed to defy logic. It pulsed subtly. Its surface seemed alive with an unsettling rhythm that mimicked the beat of a living heart. Its form was familiar architecturally, yet alien. It resembled a medieval church forged from shifting light and shadow. The spires clawed skyward, their sharp angles stark against the bleakness of the desert. The light it emitted was neither warm nor welcoming. Instead, it seeped into the air like a poison, tones of sickly yellow and brown that struggled, unsuccessfully, to coalesce into gold. The building seemed to yearn for beauty, the attempt falling short, leaving it trapped in an uncanny liminality. Arthur crouched automatically, the ridge's edge concealing him. His military instincts surged to life. Reconnaissance protocols ran through his mind. He scanned for movement, eyes darting between the luminescent structure and the shadows it cast. But the scene below remained unnervingly still. The building's buzz, the only sound reaching his ears. The noise wasn't mechanical, but something deeper and bellowing, like a didgeridoo crossed with the low resonance of a tuning fork. It burrowed into his skull, vibrating against his thoughts. Arthur clenched his jaw to force himself to focus. Carefully, he adjusted his flashlight. angling the beam downward to stay hidden. His descent from the ridge was slow and deliberate. Each step he took was measured. As he neared the structure, its details sharpened. Statues lined the facade, suggestive of angels with wings spread wide and frozen mid-flight. Angels, he thought initially. However, as the floodlights illuminated their features, a chill crawled through him. Their faces were obscured with expressions unintelligible. Their posture radiated only menace. Their trumpets were raised, horns tilted toward the heavens. Yet something felt wrong, accusatory, as if they were announcing judgment rather than salvation. These were not angels of mercy. These were not guardians of the divine. A cold sweat traced down Arthur's spine. Arthur squeezed his grip on his flashlight, his knuckles blanching. "This place," he murmured, his voice drowned by the oppressive air around him. He scanned the area again. His eyes were sharp for any sign of movement. The stillness persisted, leaving only his mounting dread. The structure seemed to watch him, its presence heavy and suffocating. Arthur felt undeniably vulnerable. He felt like a man stripped bare of his defenses. Fear crept into his mind. Regardless, he pressed forward. Whatever this place was, he knew that it must hold the answers to all of this incredible strangeness. He wasn't sure what he would find here, but he simply could not afford to ignore it. It had taken him nearly 2 hours to cross the desert expanse to the ridge. Arthur's body ached from the relentless march. He crouched behind a boulder on the outskirts of the structure. The desert air clung to him, dry and heavy. The night began to take on a crisp chill. Despite the fatigue creeping into his limbs, his mind churned with questions that refused to settle. What kind of structure could appear overnight, its spires seemingly summoned from the void? What technology could produce such an otherworldly glow? And the ships, those massive, cylindrical crafts he saw floating in the sky, what could have built them, much less pilot them? Arthur adjusted his position, careful not to dislodge any loose stones that might betray his presence. His eyes remained locked on the building, its peculiar luminance issuing long, jagged shadows over the barren ground. The way it pulsed rhythmically gave him the unsettling impression that the entire structure was alive. It breathed in unison with an unseen force. Some movement above caught his attention. Another ship descended toward the structure, its presence blocking the stars. The craft was massive, its surface gleaming like polished obsidian. Arthur squinted, trying to make out the details. The lack of visible engines or exhaust baffled him. It seemed to glide on an unseen current, defying every principle of aerodynamics he'd ever studied. The ship neared the building. A noise began to drift through the air, softly at first, but growing steadily louder. Arthur stiffened, his breath hitching. It was an unusual music. At first, it was hauntingly beautiful, clear, ringing tones of trumpets layered with a choir's ethereal harmony. The melody resonated deep within him. It stirred emotions he couldn't name. But as the music swelled, something darker crept in, a discordant note that twisted the hymn into something monstrous. The once heavenly melody now carried an undertone of malice, a malevolence that made his stomach churn. Arthur's jaw tightened. He could feel the sound pushing against him, clawing at the edges of his thoughts like an unwelcome intruder. He gripped his knees, forcing himself to remain in reality. The ship docked with seamless precision, its arrival punctuated by a final, triumphant blast of the trumpets. He exhaled forcefully, trying to clear his head. "What the hell am I looking at?" he muttered under his breath. For a long time, Arthur remained crouched behind the boulder, watching. The ships came and went with surreal regularity. Each arrival was accompanied by that haunting music. No figures emerged from the building to greet the crafts, nor did any descend from the ships. The system must have been automated. The thought sent another chill down his spine. What was the purpose? When the first seemingly unnatural rays of dawn began to slither across the desert, Arthur's apprehension deepened. The daylight would soon expose him. Staying hidden would be impossible. Yet his curiosity burned brighter than his fear. He had come this far. He simply could not leave without understanding at least a fragment of what was occurring here. He scanned the area, his eyes landing on a vent. It was set into the base of the structure. It was small, the rusted gate barely visible against the walls shifting. His heart pounded as he weighed his options. Entering the building felt like stepping into a trap, but remaining outside simply wasn't an option. Arthur took a steadying breath, his thoughts zipping back to his time in the army. He'd been in worse spots before. Mogadishu had taught him the value of calculated risks, of trusting his intuition even when the odds seemed insurmountable. "You've got this," he uttered, as much to himself as to the brutal silence around him. He crept toward the vent, his movements slow and calculated. Each step felt monumental, the distance elongating impossibly as his pulse hammered in his ears. When he reached the gate, he tested it gently. It creaked slightly under his touch, but swung open with surprising ease. Arthur hesitated, peering back at the boulder where he'd been hidden. The desert was vast and indifferent, a drastic contrast to the unnatural throbbing of the structure before him. He steeled himself. There was no going back now. With a final look over his shoulder, Arthur slipped into the vent. The darkness swallowed him whole. The vent carried a metallic tang that filled his nostrils as he crawled forward. The confined space constricted him on all sides. He forced himself to focus, moving steadily toward whatever lay at the end. His flashlight illuminated the narrow duct ahead, its beam flickering slightly. The cadenced hum of the building grew louder, reverberating through the metal walls like a heartbeat. Arthur pressed on, his mind racing. Whatever awaited him inside, he was certain of one thing. This place was not meant to be found. The air inside the vent was suffocating, thick with the stench of rust and decay. Each movement Arthur made resonated in the slim space. The sound was intensified and distorted by the duct's metallic walls. He crawled slowly, his elbows scraping against the warm metal, the pinched space compressing him like an iron vise. Claustrophobia tightened its grasp on his mind, each shallow breath threatening to spiral into panic. He forced himself to focus on the steady rhythm of his movements. Left hand, right hand, knee, knee. Anything to drown out the oppressive confines that seemed to amplify every frantic thought. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. There was a barely perceptible sound, like footsteps. Or was it? It was soft, irregular, and impossible to pinpoint. Sweat trickled down his temple as he strained to listen, his pulse throbbing in his ears. Nothing. Arthur exhaled shakily, willing his limbs to move despite the cold dread inching through him. He hadn't come this far to freeze up now. After what felt like an eternity, the vent opened into a corridor. Arthur lowered himself cautiously, his boots landing softly on the floor below. He crouched low, taking a moment to orient himself. The air here was more humid, bearing a mix of oil and something acrid that stung in his nostrils. His flashlight illuminated the walls. They were tarnished steel, streaked with grime, and etched with curious, organic patterns. They reminded him of veins, their lines twisting and branching with no discernible purpose. The hum of machinery was louder now, a deep, sonorous thrum that seemed to vibrate beneath his ribs. But that wasn't the only sound. Whispers, distant and unintelligible. They drifted through the air, mingling with remote, muffled screams and low, mournful moans. The noises clawed at the edges of Arthur's mind, stirring memories long ago buried. They invoked reminders of the chaos of Mogadishu, the cries of his crewmates, the eerie silence that followed. Arthur swallowed hard. His clasp tightened on his flashlight as he convinced himself to take a step forward. Then another. "What the hell is this place?" he muttered under his breath, his voice scarcely audible over the grim cacophony. As he moved deeper into the corridor, the walls seemed to close in, a burdensome solidity bearing down upon him. His flashlight flickered, casting warped shadows across the steel. Ahead, the corridor opened into a cavernous space, its size and scope barely discernible in the dim light. Arthur stepped cautiously into the room, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. Then he saw them, the tanks. The vessels loomed in sullen rows, stretching into the darkness like sentinels. Each one was nearly 30 feet tall, their translucent surfaces vaguely glowing with the same sickly, rhythmic pulse. Arthur approached the nearest tank, his breath halting as a low, anguished moans emanated from within. The groans seemed to vibrate through his very bones, triggering an innate need to flee. But he couldn't. He had to see. He pressed a hand against the cool glass of the tank, leaning closer to peer into the murky interior. Shapes moved within. Their forms were indistinct but undeniably alive. As he watched, one shadow shifted closer, pressing against the glass as if aware of his presence. Arthur stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice catching in his throat. The sound of his own words felt out of place here, like an intrusion into something both sacred and terrible. He turned his flashlight toward another tank, then another. Each one emitted the same haunting energy, the same symphony of anguish that seemed to wax louder with every step he took. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The tanks weren't large enough for the number of beings that appeared to be in them, yet the shadows within moved as if living. A terrible thought crept into his head. They weren't just alive, they were aware. He thought of Murden, the enigmatic scientist whose experiment had set him on this path. Had Murden known about this place? The man's cryptic warnings and evasive answers came flooding back, accompanied by a barbed stab of anger. If Murden had known, if he had sent Arthur here knowingly, then the scientist had far more to answer for than Arthur had realized. The room itself appeared to breathe, the pulsing of the tanks casting odd, flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Arthur's unease deepened. This place wasn't abandoned, not entirely. The walls felt animated, the atmosphere charged with an energy he couldn't name. He scanned the room, his flashlight sweeping over a massive network of pipes that connected the tanks. Their surfaces glistened with gooey condensation. The pipes pulsed too. Somehow this suggested something distinctly sinister. Arthur tightened his hold on the flashlight, his knuckles white. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to retreat before it was too late. But something deeper within him urged him forward. Whatever horrors lay ahead, he had no choice but to face them. Running wasn't an option. Not anymore. Arthur moved further into the room, each footstep intentional. The tanks loomed larger as he approached the center, their glow pulsing in an unsettling rhythm. The sound of his boots on the floor echoed through the vast chamber, accompanied by the rough hum that seemed to convulse the air itself. The pipes connected to the tanks crisscrossed the room, their branching patterns resembling the arteries of some grotesque beast. Small gauges and valves blinked with alien symbols, their meanings incomprehensible but clearly purposeful. Arthur's flashlight caught a slow drip of viscous liquid oozing down one of the pipes, pooling in a dark puddle on the floor. He crouched to examine it, but the bitter smell rising from the substance made him recoil. It left his eyes stinging. Thoughts whirled inside his head as he tried to make sense of everything. The tanks, the sounds, the pulsing light, none of it congruent with anything he'd ever experienced. This wasn't some secret military installation or black-budget experiment gone awry. This was something else entirely. This defied the very laws of the world he knew. Then he noticed movement. It was subtle at first, an obscure ripple in the murky depths of the tank closest to him. Arthur held his breath as he stepped nearer, the beam of his flashlight penetrating the glass. The form within twisted and writhed, its silhouette grotesque and alien. For a brief moment, he caught a glimpse of an eye, or what he perceived as an eye, staring directly at him. Arthur stumbled back, his heart pounding. The thing in the tank writhed closer to the glass, its shadow elongating as though reaching for him. A muffled emanation escaped the tank, a garbled noise that made his spine quiver. He wasn't sure if it was speech, or a cry, or something far worse. He clung even more strongly to his flashlight as he forced himself to turn away from the creature. There were too many tanks to investigate them all, and every second spent in this place felt like he was tempting fate. Whatever these creatures were, they didn't belong here. Maybe they didn't belong anywhere. A new sound caught his attention, soft, deliberate, and assuredly close. Footsteps. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as he froze, his ears straining to pinpoint the direction. The steps were purposeful, tapping against the cold metal floor. He quickly switched off his flashlight, plunging himself into near darkness. A shadow emerged from the far end of the room, its figure humanoid but unquestionably wrong. Its movement was just too fluid, too smooth. It sent every instinct in his body screaming for him to run. But he stayed perfectly motionless, pressed against the edge of one of the tanks, his hand inching toward his pistol. The figure stopped, its head swiveling slowly. Arthur could barely make out its features. A glint of metal caught his eye. The thing wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its head tilted unnaturally, almost bird-like, as if surveying the room. Arthur's pulse thundered in his ears as the figure turned slightly. Its movements were mechanical. The hum of the machinery around them seemed to grow louder, reverberating in his skull. It took a step closer, its feet barely making contact with the ground. Arthur's fingers brushed the grip of his pistol. He hesitated. If he made a sound, it would be over. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and moved away. Its steps faded into the distance. Arthur let out a shaky breath, his body trembling from tension and exhaustion. Whatever that thing was, it had been searching for something or someone. Compelling himself to move, Arthur slipped through a narrow gap between two tanks. His eyes looked for any sign of an exit, but the room drew endlessly on, its far edges obscured in shadow. A corridor, formed by two of the rows of tanks, stretched into shadowed infinity. Arthur walked through it, moving cautiously. His steps were hardly audible on the dusty floors. There were no signs of life. No maintenance workers, no guards, no controllers. The walls were tarnished, streaked with grime and rust, and the air smelled of oil and decay. It felt abandoned, like a monument to something forgotten, left to wither and crumble in isolation. The only living thing he saw seemed to be out of place, like a creature in a bad dream. Yet the machinery droned on, and the glowing tanks he'd passed earlier pulsed, as if feeding off some unseen energy. The paradox unsettled him. How could a place feel so alive and yet so dead at the same time? Arthur's grasp tightened around his pistol. He glanced down at it, surprised. He didn't even remember having drawn the weapon, yet there it was, ready and waiting in his hand. He slid it back into the holster, a small act of discipline to keep himself attached to reality in an environment that seemed designed to strip away all sense of control. Moving deeper into the building, Arthur came upon a courtyard. The area was wide and open, the stone ground cracked and uneven. Wild vegetation crept through the fractures. Above, the sky had begun to brighten as the first light of dawn filtered through, casting the space in soft, pale hues. The space appeared empty, but Arthur's mind told him to avoid loitering. He surveyed the perimeter and spotted a narrow staircase leading upward. Climbing it carefully, he reached a small balcony that overlooked the ground floor. There, he found an empty storage room. The space was barren, its walls bare save for streaks of rust and faint, unreadable markings. Arthur settled in, crouching near the doorway where he could keep an eye on the courtyard below. He strained his ears, listening for any hint of movement, but the courtyard was quiet. An hour passed. Arthur's muscles had begun to cramp from remaining frozen in place. He finally saw movement below. Figures emerged, stepping into the dull light of the courtyard. At first, Arthur thought they were human, but as he studied them, he realized something was off. Their proportions were abnormal, neither fully masculine nor feminine. They had soft, rounded bodies with narrow shoulders and curving hips, each dressed in what appeared to be a white robe. Their movements, too, carried an odd fluidity that didn't seem natural. Arthur watched for some time, transfixed, as the figures proceeded about their business. They ate, talked, gestured, and moved as if this place was their home. Yet their behaviors lacked the chaos and unpredictability of human activity. Everything about them seemed rehearsed, like cultists following a script. A shiver ran down Arthur's spine. He crouched lower, his breath shallow. If they noticed him, they gave no indication. Eventually, they disappeared down one of the corridors. Arthur exhaled slowly, his mind struggling to reconcile what he'd seen. This place, the strange figures, the ships, and the tanks filled with moaning creatures. It all felt like something pulled from a nightmare. But this wasn't a dream from which he could simply wake. Everything here was too vivid, too real. He didn't want to stop now. Somewhere within this structure were answers. Answers he wasn't sure he wanted, but knew he couldn't leave without. Arthur moved cautiously through the upper chambers, avoiding open spaces and staying in the shadows. Most of the doors he tried led nowhere, empty rooms, sealed passages, or dead ends. Eventually, he came upon a hallway that opened into a viewing area. The chapel lay below, and its sight stopped Arthur cold. The room was gaudy, almost garish, with gilded decorations and shimmering metallic hues that made his eyes ache. It felt like a stage, a performance space masquerading as a holy site. On the western wall was the same docking gate he had seen from the outside. The eastern wall bore a massive eye, its surface intricate and lifelike, as though it were watching everything within the room. On the floor in the center of the room was a giant stone altar, creepy, like something used for human sacrifice. Above it, there was a sizable ring embedded in the ceiling, resembling a large, recessed light. It shone slightly. Its purpose was unclear, yet it rather dominated the space. Arthur ducked in the shadows, waiting. Minutes ticked by before the sound of the next docking ship came through the circular gate high on the west wall. The spectacle unfolded as it had before, music, trumpets, and fanfare heralding the arrival of the ship. This time, however, Arthur saw something different. As the gates opened, ghostly wisps emerged from the ship, their forms insubstantial and shifting like smoke caught in a breeze. The wisps drifted toward the center of the chapel, their movements eerily deliberate. Arthur's breath hitched as a beam of light shot down from the ring above, illuminating the wisps. The light rippled and twisted in ways that defied comprehension, and one by one, the spectral forms were drawn into it. They vanished without a trace. Arthur's vision blurred, and his head spun. His attention was locked on the great eye. He was unable to look away. A dizzying pressure strained against his thoughts. It dragged him toward unconsciousness. Nearly out of nowhere, a hand gripped his shoulder, steadying him. Arthur spun, startled, and found himself staring into a pair of vivid green eyes. A woman bent over him, her auburn hair falling past her shoulders. Her pointed ears marked her as something other than human, and the concern in her expression contrasted sharply with her otherworldly beauty. "I've got to get you out of here," she whispered, her voice soft but urgent. Arthur's heart raced. "Who are you?" he managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Later," she said firmly. "If they catch you, you'll wish you were dead." The gravity of her words froze him. He nodded, letting her pull him to his feet. "Follow me," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. Arthur obeyed, his questions burning unanswered in his mind. Arthur followed the woman through the labyrinthine corridors, her movements quick and precise. She navigated the space with confidence that unsettled him, as though she had walked these halls countless times. The distant hum of machinery and the echoes of footsteps behind them spurred him forward, his pulse pounding with the weight of uncertainty. "Who are you?" he whispered again, his voice nearly inaudible over their careful footsteps. The woman glanced back briefly, her sharp features highlighted by the faint glow of the walls. "Solara," she said quietly. "Solara Nightshade." The name hung in the air, enigmatic and commanding. Arthur nodded, filing it away, though it did little to answer his mounting questions. "What is this place?" he pressed, insistent. Solara's jaw tightened, but she didn't stop moving. "A mistake," she said, "and one we can't afford to stay in for much longer." Her cryptic reply only fueled his frustration, but there was no time to argue. The corridors stretched endlessly ahead, their surfaces shimmering faintly with that same unnatural glow that permeated everything in this facility. Arthur forced himself to focus, keeping close behind Solara as she led him deeper into the building. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a large hangar bay. The space was cavernous and open, its high ceilings disappearing into shadow. Rows of sleek, angular ships stood in orderly lines, their designs alien yet curiously elegant. The air was cooler here, carrying a metallic tang that set Arthur's nerves on edge. Solara crouched behind a stack of metal crates, motioning for Arthur to do the same. He joined her, his breathing shallow as he surveyed the room. "What are we doing here?" he asked, just above a whisper. Solara's green eyes darted toward the hangar entrance, her expression darkening. "Waiting," she said. "There's something I need to take." Arthur's stomach churned as he remembered the tanks, the moaning creatures, and the spectral wisps being consumed by the light. Whatever was happening here wasn't just an experiment gone wrong. It was something far more dangerous. A low rumble interrupted his thoughts. The sound grew steadily louder, vibrating through the floor as a ship descended into the hangar. It was shaped like an arrowhead, its hull gleaming with an iridescent sheen that shifted with every movement. The craft landed with a heavy thud, its thrusters hissing softly as they powered down. Arthur tensed as the ship's ramp lowered, his hand naturally going to his pistol. From its interior emerged 12 small, gray-skinned creatures. Their bulbous heads and black, unblinking eyes gave them an unsettling, insect-like appearance. They moved with purpose, their heads swiveling as they inspected their surroundings before disappearing into the building's interior. Arthur turned to Solara. "Is that what we're waiting for?" Her lips curved into a dark and predatory smile. "Yes, it is." Without another word, she slipped from the hiding spot, moving swiftly toward the ship. Arthur followed, his heart pounding. They climbed the ramp cautiously, staying low to avoid detection. The interior of the ship was dim, its walls lined with smooth panels lit with alien symbols. As they moved deeper into the craft, they encountered one of the gray creatures straggling behind. Solara reacted instantly. With innate fluidity of motion, she struck the creature hard between its bulbous eyes, the impact yielding a sickening crunch. Before it could recover, she plunged a slender knife into its chest, withdrawing it in a single, efficient movement. The creature crumpled to the floor, lifeless. Arthur stared with awe, his heart hammering. "You've done this before," he said. Solara didn't look back. "More times than I care to count." They reached the cockpit. Finding it empty, Solara slid into the pilot's seat, her fingers moving deftly over the controls. Lights flickered to life, and the ship began to drone softly as its systems powered up. "Close the hatch," she said, her tone sharp. Arthur moved quickly, finding the control panel. Solara indicated that he was correct. He closed and sealed the ramp. A hiss signaled its closure as the ship's engines roared to life. Within moments, they were airborne, the hangar bay falling away beneath them as the ship shot into the sky. Still standing, Arthur gripped the back of the co-pilot's chair, his body tensed as the craft accelerated with a speed that defied logic. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice strained. Solara glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "Somewhere they can't follow. At least, not right away." Arthur nodded as if he understood, though his mind was still struggling to catch up with everything he'd seen. The facility, the creatures, the ships, it was all too much to process. Solara leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. "You handled yourself well back there," she said, her tone lighter now. "Not many people would have made it this far." Arthur forced a small smile. Not many people would have had a choice. Solara chuckled, the sound unexpected but not unwelcome. Fair enough. She extended her hand toward him. Let's make it official. Solara Nightshade. He hesitated for a moment before taking her hand. Arthur Waite. Arthur, she repeated, as if testing the name. Her lips curled into a smile. Well, Arthur, welcome to the chaos. You're going to love it. Arthur wasn't so sure about that, but one thing was clear, his life would never be the same.
The next chapter of this novel will be posted on my YouTube channel. My other books are available on Amazon Kindle. Thank you for listening.